Ready to go?
Yep. Sure. Now,
That, I'm gonna take off my back now and search for the black place without so. Very late.
yeah, times.
Thanks, thank you. We're gonna go back, Katie and I are going back, in September, not.
Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Fow, Director of Labor at Wayne, and I have the privilege today of both bringing back the Dave Miller Memorial Lecture and also introducing today's Miller Lecturer, Steve Babson. Dr. Babson is a retired labor educator and union activist who received his doctorate in United States history in 1989 from Wayne State. He worked at Wayne State from 1983 to 2006, both as an instructor and as an extension program coordinator for education and research and labor studies, then a part of the now defunct College of Urban Labor and Metropolitan Affairs. Steve also served as an officer of Local 6075 AFT, representing faculty and academic staff at Wayne. I met him when I arrived on campus in the fall of 1990, and I benefited from his knowledge and his sense of humor. To a new faculty member, Steve provided a good reality check on matters both of unions and of the university. As a historian and labor activist, Babson has been amazingly productive. He published his first book, Working Detroit, the Making of a Union Town, in 1984, followed by a succession of others, written for both scholarly and popular audiences. Building the Union, Skilled Workers, and the Anglo-Gaelic Immigrants in the Rise of the UAW in 1991, Lean Work, Empowerment, and Exploitation in the Global Auto Industry in 1995, The Unfinished Struggle, Turning Points in American Labor in 1999, and the co-authored The Color of Law, Ernie Goodman and the Struggle for Labor and Civil Rights in Detroit in 2010. He has written for publications like Against the Current, and has had his expertise cited on C-SPAN. Babson's most recent book, Forgotten Populists When Farmers Turned Left to Save Democracy, examines maligned farmers of the 1890s and the populist movement they started to push back against monopolies, profiteering, and income inequality, which posed a grave threat to American democratic institutions, and as I'm sure he would agree, still do. This year, in the 2024 rebooting of Labor at Wayne's Dave Miller Memorial Lecture, I could think of nobody better to present than Steve. And today he will present his presentation, his lecture, The Great Fear Then and Now. Dave Miller faced HUAC in our time, in his time, as we now face the threat to democracy in ours. Both the speaker and his subject are appropriate for this time and for this series. Please join me in welcoming this year's Miller Memorial Lecturer, Dr. Steve Babson.
Well, it's great to be greeted by a partisan crowd. Well, thank you, Liz. Really, this is a good time to be revisiting who Dave Miller is, because we're reviving the Dave Miller Lecture, and I suspect most people had no idea who Dave Miller was, even those of you who on Jefferson Avenue passed the Dave Miller building and wonder who he was.
Or didn't.
Or what?
Or didn't.
Or didn't.
I worked out.
False security. All right, so we're going to talk about Dave, and I think actually his life is very instructive and helpful for us in terms of understanding the current circumstances that we face, because he and his generation certainly faced threats to democracy in their time, and most notably in 1952, when Miller, on the right here, was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, along with 40 other Detroiters, and targeted all 41 of them as subversives, as a threat to the United States, as potential saboteurs, traitors, spies, you name it, certainly un-American. And what we're talking about here is a circumstance that's not just unique to Detroit. This was a hearing held in Detroit in the federal building downtown. But HUAC was kind of a traveling circus, and in the same year, 1952, it went to Chicago and also to New York. And in fact, over the next 10 years, it was in every major American city from Atlanta to Honolulu. And in all of those environments, it was attacking a whole generation of progressives. As I said, as spies, potential saboteurs, as traitors. And none of the 3,000 people called in front of HUAC over the course of that decade and a half were ever convicted of any such crime. In fact, they were rarely even accused of a crime. They were simply accused of a conspiracy of belief. The only two people, by the way, were convicted of perjury. That was the most severe penalty meted out on the basis of actually a violation of law. A bunch of people were actually imprisoned for contempt for refusing to cooperate with the House Un-American Activities Committee. But none of the charges of being a saboteur, a spy, a traitor, and none of these had made any sense at all. None of them were even accused of it. They were accused instead of being a member of and a participant in or a fellow traveler of the Communist Party, including the Negro National Congress. Coleman Young here, one of the 41 who were called in 1952, defended by George Crockett, as you can see here, also defending Art McFall, who was the executive director of the Civil Rights Congress, which is one of the earliest civil rights organizations, organizing street demonstrations to desegregate hotels and restaurants. Dave Miller was a participant in that Congress, Civil Rights Congress, and also played a key role in the rise of the UAW-CIO, especially at Ford. And that's basically what they were going to be accused of participating in, because their accusers really had no particular interest in matters of law. Who were their accusers? Here's one of them. John Rankin, Democrat of Mississippi. This is the guy who in 1945 reestablished HUAC. It had lapsed after being founded in 1938. It had lapsed during World War II. He reestablished HUAC as a permanent committee. This is his comment in 1943 talking about Detroit. This is his understanding of what caused the race riot of that year, 1943. Communistic Jews kissing these Negroes and trying to force their way into white restaurants, hotels, picture shows, whatnot. This is what the Civil Rights Congress was actually about. Was actually invading these locations and forcing them to desegregate. Obviously, Rankin had a very negative opinion of that kind of behavior. Likewise, Martin Dies. This is the guy who founded HUAC back in the late 1930s. This is his assessment of who these thousands of foreign-born communists were all about, that they're here to plot the overthrow of the United States. And so HUAC is about smoking out these individuals, identifying them and branding them. No particular criminal charges brought, simply a matter of their belief and their associations with a left-wing movement. And part of the reason I show these quotes is to reinforce an understanding that, and I think a lot of you in this room know this, that crazy talk is not new in the United States.
Yeah.
It's been around for a while. And we have some current practitioners of it. Likewise focused on illegal immigrants, likewise focused on aliens. In this case, even mimicking some of the language of Nazi Germany and talking about poisoning the blood of the nation. Down here, when millions of aliens are storming our gates, we shall not be admitting into our society those who would contaminate or subvert it. Sounds like Trump, doesn't it? It wasn't. That was Pat McCarran in 1952, the same year that Miller is being pulled in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. In this case, this is McCarran's argument on behalf of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, which was a severe measure that permitted the warrantless arrest of any alien deemed to be a subversive, essentially communist, subverter of the American system, and their trial without a jury, held without bail, and deported without a hearing. That's what that law established. So Pat McCarran is another enemy of the folks called before HUAC. We won't be focusing on the Senate side of things. We're going to be talking about the ways in which McCarran was half right. He was half right. Immigrants were not contaminating America. But those who I've identified here as part of the HUAC cohort and others like them, left-wing immigrants and some naturalized, some still resident alien, they were actually subverting the standard established status quo in Detroit and elsewhere. That is white supremacy and union busting. That was the status quo in Detroit. That was the status quo in much of the United States in the 1920s and 1930s. And Miller is definitely about subverting that. And so we want to talk about what that meant and what that represents in terms of our understanding of the history that follows. And I'm going to talk about this in 4 steps. I'm going to talk about what made Miller and his fellow immigrants subversive of Detroit's status quo. So what were they about in Scotland in particular, talking about Miller? How did he cope with the suppression of labor and civil rights in Detroit? Second part of the presentation. Third, how did the Red Scare and HUAC threaten his generation of radicals? And fourth, how that compares with what we face today. And in fact, that last thing I think will make it more of a discussion in terms of trying to relate what we see here, what we understand to be going on today. All right, so Miller. So what makes him subversive of the status quo? What makes him subversive of union busting and white supremacy, particularly the union busting, but also white supremacy? And I think it's as with any immigrant, what we start with is an understanding of 2 aspects of what they bring. First is their experience in the world that they reject and resist. And secondly, their arrival with high expectations in their adopted land. So they're contrarians in where they come from, and they're strivers in where they arrive. Unusual in that respect, and in particular, if they're, as in the case of Miller and many of the other folks coming from Scotland and elsewhere, bringing along progressive and, in fact, revolutionary ideas about how to address the issues facing working people around the globe. So in Miller's case, he's coming from Dundee, Scotland. And Dundee, Scotland, on the east coast of Scotland, is a major industrial center. It's actually a textile center, not cotton. It's producing jute, which is a coarse fabric that's turned into burlap, turned into sailcloth, and other heavy fabrics. And this is a major area of production, 40,000 workers in the jute industry in the 1890s and early years of the 20th century. Kind of unique. It's 70% women and girls, only basically 5 to 6% men, 10% boys. This is the world that Miller is introduced into. He begins work in this industry at age 13. At age 13. School leaving is permitted in Scotland at age 14. At age 13, he's working half-time in the mill. He's paid on if he was working full-time, it would be about 14 shillings a week, about $3 to $4 a week, by the way. Now, prices are lower, but still, this is poverty wages, because in actually Scotland this time, as you can see, the jute, the raw material, is coming from India, from Calcutta. And what's happening is that the mill owners are starting to build mills in Calcutta. And in the 1880s, they begin to import much of that jute into the United Kingdom. So they're actually competing with imported jute produced under obviously very different circumstances and even lower wages. And so it's a constant battle, and one that's basically a battle with extreme poverty. Talked about being a contrarian, he becomes one. He starts out, by the way, in the Temperance Society of the Episcopal Church and active in the Prohibition Party, which his parents were both active in. But he discards all of that early on, as he basically in his oral history, as he describes it, the British ate roast beef, we ate oatmeal. He lived in extreme poverty. The slums, by the way, of Dundee were notorious in Europe for the abysmal conditions that characterized life in that part of Scotland. So, who's he with? He's with these women. This becomes a very unique union in the history of both the United Kingdom and also when you think about the global labor movement. This is a very early industrial union that actually is able to sustain itself and actually deal with the employer, not on the basis of equality, because there's always a threat of competition hanging over it. But this union is an industrial union early on, 1890s into the 1910s. It's overwhelmingly women workers. They're extremely militant. This study by Emma Wainwright is a fascinating study because as she points out, this estimate of the number of strikes is an underestimate. There are hundreds more, some of them only 2 hours, 4 hours long. There's no grievance procedure. The way they deal with grievances is by immediate action on the job. interesting union because these women, as they organize it, also insist on the following provision in the charter. Of the executive board, 24 members, half have to be women. So it's women-led, it's women militants, and this is where Dave Miller learns. He's weaned on not his mother's milk, but these many women in factory, where he learns the lessons of solidarity and direct action. His first strike is at age 13. The foreman kicks one of his workmates and they walk out. And they empty out 2 factories in the neighborhood. That's the style of direct action that he becomes accustomed to. Age 14, he's able to actually take full-time work, and he hires onto the tram system. This is actually a shot from Dundee. This is the Windsor line in Dundee. We haven't been able to find any early photographs of Dave Miller, part because the records were destroyed at Local 22 in a flood. We just don't have any pictures from his 30 years that he spent in Scotland. But I'm going to ask you to pretend that that's him. This handsome lad is Dave Miller. And at the age of 17, he'd already organized. He was actually the organizer of this chapter of the tram and vehicle workers. And he had actually already started to negotiate for and led a strike on behalf of winning a 9-hour day. That might not sound like much, but they were working split shifts from dawn till dusk. It's transportation. So they actually win a straight 9-hour day. This is his experience at the age of 17. And it's not an uncommon experience in the United Kingdom. This is a Leo Woman put this together in the late 1930s as a measure of the comparative labor densities in the United Kingdom and in the United States. And as you can see, they start out with roughly the same number of workers in 1905. By 1920, obviously, almost double the number of workers are organized in the United Kingdom. Not quite double. But look at the difference in density. The United Kingdom is a much smaller nation. It's 30% density. The United States, 11%. Now, both are going to fall after 1920. This is a peak related to the war years. World War I, that begins in Europe in 1914. But this is a movement, in other words, that has long before it was possible to consider this the United States. This is an extraordinarily high level of union density and union activity, and it's a highly varied labor movement. Industrial unions, craft unions, amalgamated craft unions. And it's also a movement that has a political arm. Beginning in the 1890s, the Independent Labor Party. After 1900, it's the Labor Representation Committee, which becomes the Labor Party. Both of them are socialist parties. It's a sort of sewer socialism. It's not the advanced socialism that some on the left would eventually insist upon. And you see them here in the British Socialist Party, later the Communist Party of Britain. But they are a sizable number of people are willing to reject the Rupert Murdochs of their day. That right hand, I kind of like that photo on the right hand side there. By 1918, the Labor Party is getting over 2 million votes, 21% of the vote in 1918. In 1923, they get 31% of the vote, and they put 190 representatives in parliament. Then the following year, they actually establish a labor government. It's a minority government. This is all fraught, complicated, and lots of disappointment in terms of what they're actually able to do. My point isn't to talk about those matters, we'd be here all day, but actually to talk about the fact that what Miller and many of the other Scottish and English immigrants who are coming to Detroit and becoming active in the UAW are bringing a class consciousness and a sense of direct action and its efficacy, and in fact, wonder why it hasn't already happened in the United States. They're contrarians and they're strivers. They really cannot understand why American workers haven't taken the steps to do what was natural and assumed to be the case in Europe, and in England in particular, but in Europe in general, maybe more so even in Germany. And in fact, the German socialist parties in England and France and elsewhere, they all vow that they will not participate in any imperialist war. And that's disappointed in 1914, when across the board, with very few exceptions, the socialist parties actually dropped their opposition to war. And on the expectation that it'll be a short one and driven by nationalist fervor throughout Europe, men were fearful not of being killed, but of not getting a chance to fight before the war was over. They would soon learn better. They would soon learn better. But initially, the movement takes an enormous step backwards. Now losses begin to mount. The efforts to recruit intensify. In one day in 1916, the British Army in northern France at the Battle of the Somme, in one day, 21,000 soldiers were killed. By the end of the war, the death toll is over 700,000 in England alone. 8 million soldiers killed, 20 million total when you include civilian fatalities. It's an extraordinary moment in world history of mechanized mass destruction of armies that was unimaginable before. And actually, to continue the fight, we need more men and still more until the enemy is crushed. Well, they run out of volunteers, and so they start conscripting. 1916, and the Conscription Act includes an interesting dimension. There's several highly placed Quakers and pacifists in the British government, and they insist upon, including in the Conscription Act, a provision for conscientious objectors. And quite a few folks are appalled by this. Very few actually take advantage of it. Roughly about 16 to 20,000 folks in England take advantage of that conscientious objector option. They're stigmatized, they're pilloried, they're vilified, homophobic ridicule. This is a mob in 1916 in London attacking an anti-conscription party meeting. And that means leftists like Miller, like his brother-in-law, Bob Stewart, I should have mentioned, an older man, about 10, 15 years older than Miller. He actually refuses to enlist, and so does Miller. They refuse to actually comply with the law at all. This brother-in-law is actually an early organizer of the Communist Party. He later becomes a pallbearer at Lenin's funeral. He's also an organizer of the transport work, and he's Miller's mentor, as he put it. And you can connect the dots in any way you care to here. But the point is that he's going to end up in jail. It was an imperialist war. I wouldn't claim to be a conscientious objector because I wasn't. I was anti-militarist. And he's marched through town at bayonet point. This was not uncommon, by the way. About probably 12,000 of the conscientious objectors went to prison at some point. And the 2,000 absolutists who said, I'm not a conscientious objector, I'm not a pacifist, I will not participate in an imperialist war, all 2,000 of them go to prison. Under some pretty severe circumstances. This is Miller's experience. 2 years of hard labor, you're in solitary confinement most of the time, never see a soul, nothing to read except the Bible. That way he didn't agree with the Bible. No communications, whatever, no letters or in and out for politicals. These are the two prisons he went to. This is called Wormwood. It's in London. This is its interior. This is Dartmoor in the southwest corner of England. And this is the interior. It looks like something out of Harry Potter. And it could not have been anything but a miserable existence. Extraordinary psychological pressure on these people. Repeatedly told that they're subject to a firing squad, potentially down the road. Several of them are actually taken to France and lined up in front of a firing squad. This is the world he comes from. In other words, a world in which the great fear is for him. Nothing new about that in later years. It starts with his experience in Scotland. End of the war, he's finally released from prison, but he's stripped of his voting rights. He's blacklisted, he can't find work. Unemployment in Scotland in particular is over 20% as the war industries are shut down. He's reliant on his wife, Anne, who's working in the homes of wealthy folks. He actually does find work for a short period in a shipyard working on a false employment. A precedent that will soon be duplicated in Detroit, where he spends the first roughly 15 years of his time in the city under an alias. He's finally going to decide to go to the United States. So what's he expecting to find there? Well, what a lot of people expected to find was the $5 day and a new future based on a much more highly remunerated kind of advanced labor, but in a obviously intense production line circumstance, very different from the work experience of folks in Great Britain, but nevertheless, a promise of extraordinary improvement in terms of the wages, at least, that are paid. That might have been his expectation. He might have known better. This is headlines from 1914. By 1920, the headlines had changed. And in fact, this is pretty much happening as he's crossing the Atlantic to come to the United States. They're preparing to deport 800 to 900 radicals who have been swept up in the Palmer raids of that year, named after the Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. On a moment that in Detroit in particular, by the way, these numbers all underestimate the final tally. The total tally across the country in about 23 different states is 10,000 workers swept up, most of them without any warrants. In Detroit, it's 800 people. It includes, basically, they would walk into a dance hall or into a fundraising meeting or in a union meeting and arrest everyone, herd them into the upper floors of the post office, and then over the course of a week, decide who they were going to keep and who they weren't going to keep. So it's warrantless, it's highly illegal, it's extra legal. This is the beginning of the national security state. And in fact, we find a lot of continuity between what's going on here, and what would later characterize Miller's experience in Detroit. Because the organization that is established to manage this is put in the hands of a young 23-year-old lawyer in the Department of Justice. His name is Herbert Hoover. Excuse me, J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover. And the Bureau of Investigation that he inherits to organize the Palmer raids has 34 agents. By 1924, it has 460 agents. By 1951, it had 4,600 agents. So we're seeing an embryo in the Palmer raids, this indiscriminate, extra legal rounding up of folks simply on the basis of their membership. That's all that that's brought to bear here. And these guys are all going to be 800 to 900 of them are going to be deported. You can see the government is arranging for a ship that might have been crossing the Atlantic going the other way as Miller's coming to arrive in New York. One other thing I'll draw attention to here. Plot to raise Negroes bare. Trouble is yet feared because of subtle propaganda for race equality. As I've argued, the DNA of HUAC and much of the Red Scare begins in the 1920s with white supremacy. And what radicals were about was not simply, and although as important as this is, the organization and building of union power, but also an effort to assault and attack the whites-only world that prevailed at that time, as it did in Detroit. 1924, this is the Ku Klux Klan rally at the Detroit Fairgrounds. This was no small time event. In that year, the Ku Klux Klan candidate won the election for mayor in Detroit, Chester Bowles. The writing candidacy, and a lot of his followers misspelled his name. Therefore, he never took office. But the majority of voters voted for the Klan candidate in 1924. There were cross burnings on the steps of City Hall. The city is characterized almost exclusively by apartheid in terms of where blacks could live and certainly where they could work. Most every restaurant, theater, hotel was whites only. And the auto industry highly segregated. In most cases, Ford's only a partial exception. In most cases, blacks were segregated into the foundry, body and white, and other noxious kinds of work environments. So this is the world that Miller arrives and looks for, is expecting to find a place as an improvement on his circumstances in Scotland. And he hires into Fort Highland Park. Now this is to me fascinating because he says in his oral history, he says, the obligation of any serious organizer is to find a skill, that is indispensable to management. It improves your chances that you won't be fired. Doesn't preclude being fired, but you want to find a skill that puts you in a position to understand the entire industry and to have some leverage in terms of your personal bargaining. So what does he do? He enrolls in the Ford School and he learns the new science of spray painting. Now, this may sound like not much, but back in the day, this is in 1923 is when spray painting is invented. Up until when they're hand painting the car. 1923, Duco painting is involved, spray painting. And it's highly volatile and very dangerous. If it goes wrong, as it did in 1927 at Briggs, just down the road, the entire plant exploded and killed 21 workers. And that was an explosion called by the Duco paint spray. And so it's a precision job as a chemist, and he becomes an expert paint chemist. And in fact, eventually, he's going to become indispensable to the Ford Motor Company at the Rouge, interesting enough. Now, he's also, on the other hand, has to be careful in an environment where union busting was the other half of what the status quo was about. And I think everyone in this room is probably familiar with this guy. You might be aware also that the law at the time defined any kind of picketing as an implied violence, and therefore you could be arrested simply for picketing. If it's a peaceful picket line, it didn't matter. It's an implication of violence, and therefore you would be picked up. Santos Peron is one of the allies of the Ford Motor Company. He and the Licavoli gang are the ones providing a lot of the muscle and power that goes into the Ford Service Department, the largest private army in the United States, 4,000 members, dressed like this, not plant security, dressed like this with a big lump under one arm, where the automatic pistol was. What's interesting here, and I want to come back to this and remind people as we go, is that this is the sort of troika of the national security state. Government power allied with private corporate power, and depending on vigilante action. We'll see this repeated. Public power, corporate power, and vigilante action. Now, Miller's aware of this, and he becomes a man living two worlds. On the job, he's Dave Miller, and #1 paint specialist at the Rouge. He's sent there to train supervision on how to paint cars. They'd been making tractors at the Rouge up until 1927. So he's the key guy training the painters at the Rouge. He's still, and by the way, a blue-collar worker. He's not white-collar, he's not management, but he's indispensable. He's meanwhile, as Tom Stewart, adopting the last name of his wife and Bob Stewart, remember his mentor, he's active in the left wing, small but growing, particularly in the 1930s, but in the 1920s already on the ground. And he's working with John Anderson in particular, another Scotsman who later led the first sit-down strike in Detroit at Midland Steel. And the two of them and other members, some of them also Scottish, some of them obviously US, some of them Eastern European, Southern European, a lot of these early radicals who are working underground, which was necessary in this environment where you could so easily be fired for your union activity. For some 16 years, I fooled the Ford Motor Company with two names. With Bill Mackay, a Scotsman, he and I cooperated all during the 20s, right up to the 30s, and laying the seat for organization underground at Ford. Now, Mackay was an open public member of the Communist Party later on. But he's at Ford, he's not an open communist, but he's to anyone working with him, they well knew what his politics were. I don't know what Dave Miller, whether or not he joined the Communist Party or not. He certainly hung around them a lot. And he's active with Mackay. These are the two guys who actually organized the Auto Workers Union, the Ford Rouge plant, which is the Communist Party predecessor to the AFL and to the UAW. This is the last strike that the AWU organizes in the 1920s, because in this year, massive unemployment, and I think we all know the story of the Great Depression here in Detroit. Unemployment that peaked at about, they estimate, about 50% unemployment in Detroit. But he's doing all right. Miller's doing okay. I used to handle all the Ford family cars. I knew the man Henry very intimately. I was up at his home every week when I was operating as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But here's a guy working with the communists at the Ford Rouge with an alias outside of the plant, who's also up here at Fairlane, doing the trim and the polishing and the finishing of the Ford automobiles. Had a very low opinion of Henry Ford, and ultimately they had a low opinion of him. He's fired in 1935. He and Mackay, as they were organizing underground, meetings of only 5 or 6 at a time. And those 5 or 6 don't know the identities of any of the other meetings of 5 or 6 people. They all have aliases. At one point, they only give people numbers. And the only people who knew their names were Mackay and Miller, who screened them. Apparently not well enough, because both were fired, 1934 and 1935. I recognize Henry Ford as being an extreme egotist. That's the least of what he said, but I didn't want to burden him with the rest of it. Obviously a low opinion, but Ford had some people who actually thought very well of it. 1938, when Ford is awarded a Nazi medal, Grand Cross of the German Eagle, And Ford's not alone in that regard.
Yeah.
Father Coughlin, 1936, democracy is doomed. This is our last election. It is fascism or communism. I take the road to fascism.
Mm.
Now, Miller, he's now unemployed. He goes to New York City where his daughter lives. He had one daughter. And he's visiting with her. I got mucking around in New York. He got active with the Young Socialist League, where Coughlin in that city also had a terrific following. Some of you, I think, are aware of the history of Father Coughlin, a very right-wing radio priest with millions of followers, increasingly enamored of fascism as an alternative. They called a conference on Long Island. We prepared a leaflet exposing this man. So they go and they start to leaflet the hall where Coughlin's supporters are meeting. About 5 big men came out and dragged me over to an automobile. I really thought I was going to be taken for a last roundup. They drove me about 550 odd miles down the island and warned me not to come back. The great fear was one he had been living with long before HUAC showed up. And I've got here a picture of the Black Legion. I don't have pictures of these big guys. I have this guy here, Alan Bassam. He was arrested in 1936 for kidnapping a New Deal relief worker down in Lincoln Park, I think, and driving him out to the countryside where he's terrorized and obligated to renounce his affinity for the New Deal. That was the least of it. The Black Legion was actually convicted. 46 of them went to prison, confessions and convictions, for at least, that we've confirmed, 12 murders of left-wingers and organizers. 2 of them, by the way, were members of the Auto Workers Union, the same group that Miller's with. One of them, George Belcher, was from the Ford plant. He's picked up in 1933 by the Black Legion, which is a right-wing splinter group from the Ku Klux Klan. They thought the Klan was too moderate. They wear black robes, hence the name Black Legion. And they took Belchuck, they drove him out into the countryside west of Detroit and put a bullet in his head, shot him in the head. Well, they did the same with several others. They also floggings, fire bombings of union halls. Again, the great fear is actually something that starts for some people earlier on. And this is where obviously Miller was some concern about being picked up by Coughlin. He returns to Detroit and he's also being tracked by the police. He's been arrested for or taken into custody, not always charged with anything, but he's been taken into custody for trespassing on company property, for leafleting in Dearborn, where it was illegal to leaflet. The city said it would cause too much litter. He's been arrested for participating in any picket line, which is again implied violence. Not all picket lines, but often enough they're being disrupted by the police. And at this point, he's also a thickening envelope, a thickening file being collected by the Red Squad, which was a portion of the Detroit police that's feeding information to FBI, to J. Edgar Hoover's office in Washington, which eventually will end up with the shrinks. And at the same time, what they know is that these people are all becoming active in the Civil Rights Congress. They're salting into the plants on the west side. Miller goes into Cadillac, the Reuthers go into Kelsey Hayes, and they organize sit-down strikes, as we know, in 1936, following the election of Franklin Roosevelt, re-election. He runs in 36, supporting the National Labor Relations Act. The sit-down strikes are in effect a citizen's arrest. They're actually a law and order movement in an odd way, because the companies are ignoring and refusing to abide by the National Labor Relations Act. So workers seize the factories and say, we'll give them back to you once you obey the law. He goes from there and he organizes that sit-down strike in Cadillac. He's also then sent by Reuther up to Fisher Body number 1, goes into the plant and helps reorganize it in a period of crisis. In other words, his credentials in terms of being a left activist are quite substantial. And that brings him to the attention of the earliest iteration of HUAC, 1938. And this is Martin Dies, the man who's responsible for putting together the first temporary committee, as it was known then. And of course, its definition of subversive is going to be quite different from what we might have in mind. Martin Dies, for him, is basically the New Deal of minimum wage. There's a racial question involved. You cannot prescribe the same wages for black men as for the white. Our good friend John Rankin here again on the proposed anti-lynching bill. I think it should be called a bill to encourage rape. Now, this is again, I'm arguing the DNA of HUAC is white supremacy. But it's now going to take on an additional element as the Cold War escalates. And in particular, after 1949, it begins earlier, but after 1949, it's announced that there is a now confirmed network of Soviet spies. Klaus Fuchs is one of them. He confesses, along with Whittaker Chambers. And they did steal some secrets. It's overwhelmingly exaggerated. And by 1949, that whole spy network is gone. They used to be operating in the period of World War II when the Soviets were our allies, but by 1941 it's gone. And Hoover knows this, but he's going to keep beating the drum because it's a good way of getting additional funding and more agents. And as I mentioned, by 1951, 4,600 FBI agents, up from 34 in 1980. All right, so the Korean War, 1950. A lot of us forget how bloody this was. 35,000 American troops killed, 2 to 3 million die in this conflict. At a certain point, there's talk about the U.S. using an A-bomb when things aren't going so well for them. And the HUAC hearings take on a real witch hunt sort of atmosphere in which the 41 people I mentioned earlier are being directly accused of collaborating with the communists. They are not, however, going after Reuther. Reuther and the moderate center of the CIO had already been started to purge communists. There's 9 left-wing unions are thrown out of the CIO. And this is Charles Potter, a Republican legislator from Saginaw, who's basically saying, Reuther's okay. The acceptable labor movement is okay, because they've already started to purge communists. And Reuther has some real reasons, actually, for being opposed to the communists, which he once was allied with, because they did a lot of wonderful things. As Miller puts it, they did some really wonderful things. They were also made some huge blunders. And the blunders start to wear on people like Miller as well, Hoover and others. This is from his oral history. You crucified them, Walter. You didn't have to do it, expelling them from the union under the pretense that they were common. This is in a context where Miller is saying they did make mistakes. Their secretive nature, their top-down organization, their alliance with Hitler during 1939, 1941, they made some real blunders, but nevertheless, they have done some wonderful things in terms of the labor movement, and so they're thrown out. The baby goes out with the bathwater. And so the House on American Activities narrows its focus to Local 600 and the Popular Front. And there is the headlines that precede the opening of the hearings in February of 1952. And what this is about, as I mentioned earlier, is basically a shaming. There's no criminal charges being brought against anyone. The 60,000 people I mentioned here, this is over the course of about 13, 14 years. The HUAC sends 60,000 files to employer. And what they're about is actually captured by what Martin Dye said at the beginning. Exposure is the most important weapon. We can trust public sentiment to do the rest. So they're not charging them with a crime, simply with unacceptable behavior. Communist, fellow traveler, premature anti-fascist, un-American. Obviously, being a traitor, if they proved it, no, they never did, would be illegal, but the rest of these are not. And so, this is the context in which Miller arrives in February of 1952. That's Ernie Goodman sitting next to him in the courtroom, waiting for the proceedings to begin. That was his lawyer. Ernie Goodman, well-known left-wing labor lawyer in Detroit, a real legend, actually, in Detroit history. This is the one of the paid informants. He had been in the Communist Party in Detroit for 4 years as a paid undercover agent of the FBI. Dave Miller, he testifies, was a member of the Midtown Club of the Communist Party, meeting at the 12 Horsemen's Club, 114 Erskine. Actually, it said the earlier club they met was on West Warren, at the corner of Warren and Woodward, where there used to be a pharmacy and a bar, and apparently they were meeting in Belleville. And I, by the way, I'm not old enough to remember that, but this is the 12 Horsemen's Club. I couldn't help but put it in here. This is on the corner of John R. and Erskine. Down the street and to the right is the Bonstell Theater. So we're talking about our neighborhood here. And actually in the Michigan Chronicle and the Detroit Tribune, this is described as a progressive black club. And this is where the Midtown Communists are meeting. It may be that Miller was part of those meetings. It wouldn't surprise me. At this time in the late 40s, the mid-40s, the Communist Party had dissolved and reformulated itself as the Communist Association. Open to all social gatherings. We expect to live in peace with our capitalist adversaries, in peaceful coexistence. This is reflecting the efforts that Tehran and elsewhere reject that notion of the future. It turned out to be, of course, quite wrong. But at this time, it's possible he was meeting him. This is Mr. Tavener is the chief counsel for HUAC, House Un-American. He's the guy from Virginia. The chairman is from Georgia. The founders were from Texas and Mississippi. I think you get my point. Did you know Mr. O'Hare? Possibly not. Were you at any time a member of the Midtown Sector of the Communist Party? I refuse to answer that question as reserving my rights under the Fifth Amendment. According to a program dated April 2nd, you were chairman of the Michigan State Conference of the Civil Rights Congress. And by the way, he was. I went into the Civil Rights Congress papers and found that very flyer. He was actually very active in the Civil Rights Congress and would have been proud actually to talk about it. The work they did to fight discrimination and whites only, restaurants, hotels, movie theaters, you name it. The Civil Rights Congress was very active in those efforts in the late 1940s, and Miller was part of it. Who were the officers? Claim my rights in the Fifth Amendment. Another member of the HUAC committee, Mulder. Could you explain to the committee how that question would tend to incriminate? I am not called upon to give the reasons for any particular answer, and haven't done, but we can actually provide some of the answer. The key answer is that in addition to the shaming mechanism, was also the Smith Act. And the Smith Act of 1940 made it actually a person be subject to deportation or prison if it was proven that they were members of groups that incite violent revolution, advocated or conspired to advocate it in the future. Now, by the way, they never found evidence that the Communist Party was doing any of this. And if you look through the papers that we now have from the Red Squad files and from the prosecutor in the Michigan 6 case, where 6 members of the Communist Party are accused of violating the Smith Act. If you look at his letters and his correspondence, he was secretly corresponding with Goodman, who was their lawyer, and he's saying, you know, we don't have any. He later said, we have no evidence. No evidence. We have 1,500 undercover agents in the Communist Party, and they can't find no evidence of any of this. So how did they convict 130 people in the 1950s of this? Here's how. There's no evidence they're doing this. There's no evidence they're doing that. Here, they're aspiring. How do we know that? Here's a copy of the Communist Manifesto from 1848. They're calling for a violent revolution. And that sounds sophomoric. Well, it is. But that's how they were convicted. That's how they were convicted. They were bringing literature, and they would also say, well, look at Czechoslovakia in 1948, party organized a coup. It was on that basis and in that danger that actually Miller ends up 20 times invoking the Fifth. Almost all of the other participants in the HUAC hearings do so as well. Although many of them are also firing off some really heated barbs in the direction of the interrogators. Ex-unionists is balky witness in the picture of Miller in the Free Press. Suspects rap silence in Fifth Amendment. They're actually threatened with contempt of HUAC. But there's another way they can actually get balky witnesses to talk. They say that is by runouts. That's by vigilante action. And so another Bernice Baldwin, another undercover agent who had been planted in the Communist Party, she releases in the course of the hearings a list of 150 people she says were members of the Communist Party or communist front groups like the Civil Rights Congress or the Negro National Congress. Representative Jackson, another member of the HUAC committee, take some of these communists by the seat of their pants and throw them out of the unions. This is what he's saying publicly during the HUAC hearings. It's printed in the Free Press. I have no sympathy with those who say, well, so-and-so has certain rights. They're calling for vigilante action. So here we have the state organizing on behalf of an incitement of vigilante action. Does this sound familiar? Anyway, and in fact, that happens. These are cases that are across the city of Detroit in about a dozen different auto factories. Fistfights break out. In this Hudson plant, there's a sit-down strike of right-wing workers against people identified by Baldwin. This guy here, Chauvenet at American Metal Products, is actually threatened with a noose and has to be escorted out of the plant by the police. And even Wayne State, back then it was Wayne University. This is Lorraine Meisner. She had attended a meeting of the 1951 World Youth Festival in East Berlin, and for that, she actually suspended from Wayne State because that's considered, when she's asked about it and refused to testify, that is considered unacceptable of her obligations as a student. She's gone, and so are teachers, violinists, a whole range of white-collar professions, as well as blue-collar workers are run out of their jobs or fired by employers, as that list is published in the Free Press. The next day I went into the shop, I couldn't get a kind of look from anybody. The company offered me more support than the union did. He actually loses his next election. He had been plant chairman and president of the local, off and on, often moving from one to the other position. And in 1953, he's voted out. Actually, in 52, he's voted out on the basis of his alleged links to as a subversive to the Communist Party of the United States. It was a great danger to me. Had I been proven to be communist, I would have been deported, as they deported many, many union men without trial. Let me move along here. We're almost to the end. UAW moves to purge Revs from Local 600. There's a purging across the labor movement. And eventually, by the way, Carl Stellato and those purged won re-election. And so did Miller, by the way. He's re-elected down the road. Passions cool a little bit. People pay attention to the fact, particularly in the case of Miller, Miller's the guy who negotiated equal pay for equal work and one seniority list with women on the same seniority list as men. So he had a real standing among the members in that particular location. And he wins re-election, but the labor movement is permanently scarred by this. Its left wing is amputated, and discussions about anything that challenges the fundamental process of capitalist accumulation becomes very dangerous thin ice for anyone doing so. It starts to change a little bit legally at first, and that happens in 1953 when Earl Warren is appointed by Eisenhower to the Supreme Court, and we all know Brown versus Board of Education, and here we are in 1957 in Arkansas. Federal troops sent in to actually implement it. In that same year, 1957, John Harlan, another Eisenhower appointee, the Supreme Court. He later called Harlan and Earl Warren his true mistakes. Both are on the Supreme Court. But Harlan actually writes a decision invalidating the Smith Act, that law I talked about earlier. He says that's actually a violation of First Amendment rights. And obviously there's changes that follow the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement. This is the March on the Pentagon in 1967. That's me right over here. And what happens is that there is obviously a breaking down of the monolithic support for the Red Scare that had previously characterized what was going on. And I was not a fan of Jerry Rubin, but this is the HUAC hearings of 1968. And he shows up dressed as Santa Claus with a plastic pistol and is thrown out. HUAC becomes a laughingstock by 1968. This is completely disregarded. And there's other elements that are still going to be very dangerous to the left and to the labor movement. But HUAC is in effect rendered no longer a particularly effective shaming device, because there's no longer that monolithic support. Back in the early 1950s, late 40s, public opinion was overwhelmingly in favor of the Cold War Red Scare. That's no longer the case after the anti-war movement in the 1960s, the civil rights movement. The idea that the government can be trusted to identify who's subversive and who isn't has been eliminated. Miller is rehabilitated over the course of that. And in fact, particularly in the 1960s, as he organizes UAW retirees to support Medicare against the AARP, which is against Medicare at the time. That might surprise some people in the room. He becomes the head of the Retired Workers Council of the UAW. He's a founding member of the National Council of Retired Senior Citizens. And he's actually at Reuther's funeral, one of the people delivering a eulogy. He and Reuther are reconciled, obviously on a different basis from what they had been about back in the 1930s. And it's within about 7 or 8 years that actually Miller dies at the age of 88 in 1979. The Red Scare was a political incubator. As many of you know, here's Coleman Young, here's George Crockett. elected mayor of Detroit and US congressman, respectively. On the right as well, and here's, I'm coming to the end here, last two slides. On the right is Richard Nixon, a member of HUAC. That's the Alger Hiss examination, the famous microfilm found in the pumpkin patch. That's a long story, don't get me started. This is Ronald Reagan here, who HUAC called to testify against his fellow members in the Screen Actors Guild. This is Bobby Kennedy, who was Assistant General Counsel to Joe McCarthy. Very conservative man in the 1950s. And retained much of it actually in the 1960s. When he was Attorney General for his brother, he's the one who ordered the taps on Martin Luther King's phone at the recommendation of J. Edgar Hoover. Now, this has a relevance, but more current contender for power in the United States. This is Joe McCarthy, of course. Who's this guy?
Roy Cohn.
Roy Cohn. How many have heard of Roy Cohn? So you know the rest of the story here. He's the mentor for Donald Trump. And actually, in the meantime, before Trump arrives on the scene, he's a representative for the mafia in New York City. So there's a continuity here. And that brings us to I'm gonna just leave this slide up. What we have here now is a circumstance which is very different from what we faced back in the 1950s in terms of HUAC. There is no longer the monolithic support for government intervention on behalf of some acceptable and widely accepted idea of what a subversive is and what people's rights are about. That's gone. But there is still all littered across the statutes of the federal government and as well as state statutes as well. All kinds of potential for abuse. The Internal Security Act and the Immigration and Nationality Act are over time going to be declared partially either unconstitutional or rewritten as the Immigration and Nationality Act was rewritten in 1965. But some of what was lost or set aside is reintroduced in the Patriot Act. And some of that is then challenged in court and declared unconstitutional, and it appears again in the US Freedom. And we now face a whole, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Depending on who wins the election, there's the potential that they have in their toolbox an agenda that includes actually the replacing of the NLRB with courts proceedings. This is Elon Musk. And 2025, which some of you, are you familiar with 2025? This is what the Heritage Foundation, the right-wing think tank, they've come up with a plan for what Trump can do if he wins re-election. And it includes basically dismantling what they call the administrative state. And what that means is that the National Labor Relations Board, the Securities and Exchange Commission, all of those creatures of the New Deal, in which Congress set up tribunals without juries, but with administrative law judges to make decisions about the many, many cases coming their way, because it's part of commerce. The SEC and the NLRB are dealing with a whole range, a massive range of individual complaints and issues that come before them. Musk and the 2025 folks want to eliminate that. And they have a suit right now saying that that's unconstitutional under the 7th Amendment to the Constitution, which establishes jury trials in civil cases. The government is arguing against that, saying that Article 1, Section 8 empowers Congress to establish tribunals up to and immediately below the Supreme Court. So where does this go? But what's at stake is massive here. We used to always argue, well, the NLRB, if we get the wrong person in there, the appointments of the NLRB will be disastrous. That's still true. And in fact, right now we have a head of the NLRB, an outstanding individual, Jennifer Abruzzo is her name, who's been doing just wonderful work, really trying to restore what the NLRB was back 60, 70 years ago. She'd be gone, but so would the NLRB if they have their way. That's how severe it is. It's not just who's appointed the NLRB, it's whether there will be one. So I throw it open. Any other comments or additions here, disagreements? I think there's also food, is there not? So we can grab food as we, and just don't talk with your mouth full, of course, but there's food available back here. But any comments or questions, additions or subtractions, would be welcome at this point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Here and then there.
You suppose, other than sort of the softening of the anti-communism, caused the sort of rebirth of the relationship with Reuther and Miller.
Well, the destruction of the left. Miller was never considered a candidate for higher office. He was happy with remaining at Cadillac in a local 22 presidency. He was not only not a candidate for upper office, he didn't even occupy an office in the local. He refused to actually leave the plant. He never took a paid job with the local. He stayed working in the plant on the Cadillac payroll and would deal with issues in the plant. So he was not ambitious politically. And in fact, for a time, both the left and the right wing in the UAW both had equal trust in him. He was actually the liaison in much of the back and forth between the two. There was one point where Reuther actually offers George Addis a peace agreement. Well, if you will renounce the communists, I will bring you, a leader of the left wing, into my caucus. And Addis rejects it, but the guy who carries that proposal is Miller. So he's actually talking to both sides, because both sides could see that he was not an ambitious politician looking for advancement through the hierarchy. He wanted to stay at Local 22. He said, I'm happy here. I like living in Detroit. All my old white friends have left the city. I like living here. He liked working at the Cadillac plant.
Isn't that implicitly a threat to Reuther?
It could be, except what I was then going to say, but then the left is destroyed. The left is destroyed, so it's no longer a potential Miller or anyone else representing us. Well, there are some, and in fact, by the late 60s, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers is also mounting a different kind of threat. But by then, Miller is out of the plant. He's no longer in the plant. He's a retiree. And so I think also he and Reuther were pretty tight in the 30s. They actually worked together a lot. They got arrested together a couple of times. And so I think there was a retention of a certain personal time, together with the fact that the left was no longer a real threat.
And was Dave Moore brought before HUAC or part of the ouster of the local 600?
Yes, yes. The whole local 600 leadership was brought almost entirely, except for Carlos Stellato. But Dave Moore was one of them, and they're brought before HUAC as well.
I don't have a lot to add, just I really appreciate how at the start of the talk, you mentioned that this kind of anti-worker violence is also very gendered. I was wondering if you're familiar with the story of Edith Van Horn at all?
Yes.
Yeah, like when you mentioned that, we got to throw these people out of the unions, I almost thought you're going to, she's almost thrown out of the window of the wire room at Dodge, Maine, which is not on the first floor.
Right.
Because she's accused of being a communist.
Yeah, she was one of the people that run out. It was a long list.
Yeah.
I took too much time as it was, but she is definitely part of that whole, and basically vigilante action. You had a hand.
I'm really naive at this. I got my degree in accounting here at Wayne State in 1978, so I was on the other side, although I was in the UAW shortly for one summer. Why was the KKK interested in Detroit? I mean, the migration was north for African Americans. Why did not the KKK celebrate that?
The KKK, it was indigenous to Michigan and Indiana and Ohio. It wasn't Southerners bringing the KKK. It was Midwesterners deciding, hey, they got a point here.
Okay.
And in particular, it was both racist, but it was also anti-Catholic. The Ku Klux Klan in the North, particularly Indiana, there were many cases of assault on Black folks, but overwhelmingly their focus and their fire was directed at the Catholics. And the Black Legion, by the way, said, we are here to oppose the communists and the Roman hierarchy. So anti-Catholic feeling is a strong part of labor history going back a long way, but it's included in the both the Black Legion and the Ku Klux Klan in the North.
I got another, what was the composite of the worker for the $5 day for Ford? I mean, was it, from what I understand, most of the white workers moved to Dodge, Maine. And the $5 day really didn't end up to be $5 a day after the write-downs for all the cleaning and whatever, lockers.
Actually, the $5 day, it was problematic, but I don't think for that reason. I think primarily what happened was that it was made the responsibility of what they call the sociological department. And this is back in the this is after the implementation of the $5 day. And then up until into the early 1920s, Ford had about 100 inspectors, and they would go to your house to see if you were worthy of the $5 day, which is a doubling, more than doubling for some people of their wage. And if you were deemed to be unworthy, you were penalized and actually fined for that. You would then be inspected again later, and then the inspector would show up at your house to make sure you didn't have borders, to make sure you had a sales slip for furniture. They didn't want you buying on time. That they didn't want you borrowing from banks. Henry Ford was anti-Semitic and believed all banks were controlled by the Jews, except for the bank he founded in Highland Park. So it was that sociological department was already harsh and certainly patronizing, and it eventually gives way to the Ford Service Department, which simply becomes basically an armed group suppressing union organization.
Thank you.
What you said about the Catholics made me think about, well, what was Coughlin's relationship to KKK? And like, it seems like he was a tool on their behalf.
Not on behalf of the KKK. It was just, I mean, prejudice is multifaceted. There's many opportunities to be prejudiced in America, and so yeah, Coughlin was not a fan of the Klan at all. And so there was disputes on that score, but he was more closely aligned with Ford, who was anti-Semitic. And so complicated. Michelle?
Yeah, so you said at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a difference in the US, in the UK. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Why do you think that was?
Well, that's good. Let's see. Can we cater dinner? Partly it's because in the case of England, class was more firmly established and protected in law and custom, and overtly revered and defended, whereas here it was denied. It was a reality without a doubt, but there was an ideology and a contending claim about a widening opportunity that's available to everyone. And we've got a frontier. If you're angry, go west. And in the case of England, we're talking centuries going back, centuries of disputes defined by class and overtly argued on the basis of class. And so it's part of the culture, the political culture is one in which class is either defended or attacked. No one denies its existence. In the United States, it's a different world in that regard. And there's a question about why is that the case? Let's talk after. Yeah, good. I thought you had a hand.
I was gonna ask about the Coleman Young testimony, because he Coleman Young's them, didn't he?
Oh, yeah, Coleman Young, I did another presentation on him, and his testimony is outstanding. He has them apologizing to him. And it's over the pronunciation of the word Negro. It's not Negro, it's Negro. And at one point, the guy says, Coleman Young says, "I think you're slurring." He says, "I don't think I am." And Coleman said, "Well, speak more clearly if you can." And the guy says, "Okay, sorry." And then the Representative Wood, chairman of HUAC, starts to talk, and Coleman says, "No, it's Negro, not Negro." And he says, "Well, I think I pronounced it correctly." And he says, "I don't think you did. It's probably your Southern heritage." And then Wood then says, "Like Southern heritage, I'll have you know that all 112 Negroes in my village voted for me." Well, that's bullshit. And Coleman Young says, "Well, I happen to know for a fact that you denied the vote to everyone in Georgia of my people." And it's back and forth like that. And in fact, the black, there's 10 black out of the 41, there's 10 black witnesses. And I did a textual analysis of how they respond. And there are whites who give HUAC, a good kick in the rear, without a doubt. Some of them from Local 600 in particular. Walter Reuther and Paul Bowden, they really go after the committee. But it's the black witnesses who really scorch them and say, on what grounds you talk about being, that we're un-American? You're the ones denying the vote to my people in Alabama, Mississippi, what have you. And they really go after them. And I think for the black witnesses, this was it wasn't customary, but they were used to this kind of abuse and this kind of treatment. And Coleman Young's telling HUAC where to jump. A lot of people figured, and Coleman said this as well in his autobiography. He said, I said to them the words that all my black friends really had wished and hoped they could have said to the white boss in their experience in their childhood and whatnot. And so on that grounds, he emerges with a higher stature in the black community. He's still blacklisted because most employers are white, but he emerges actually with a point of respect at some of the other black witnesses as well. And certainly Crockett and Coleman Young vindicate that years later when they're both elected to high office. Here and then there.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the parallel with the HUAC and what's happening right now with the education workers hearings in Congress and university presidents being called into DC. It's making me wonder, or also set it up so like the hearings went really poorly for the like Harvard and Penn presidents a few months ago, but like tomorrow they've called in Rutgers and UC chancellor, and then some of Northwestern. And the unions, there's like 5 locals, UAW and AFT locals, that are going to be going to DC to try to kind of organize outside of the hearings and sort of come as a union presence. And so it's making me wonder if with the HUAC hearings, as the union members were being targeted, was there organized resistance in any of the locals, like against the hearings themselves or against?
Not much. The only local that did was Ford Local 600. And there is a picket line when HUAC opens in Detroit, but it's only about 40 people. And most of them are folks who identified with the Popular Front, with what the HUAC investigators would have said, yeah, these are Communist Front organizations. And they were organizations that the Communist Party played a critical role in initiating. They also have non-communist members, but they do have obviously prominent communists in positions of leadership. And so there is, by 1952, there's a feeling that this is toxic. You don't want to go, this is kryptonite. You don't want to go anywhere near the courthouse. And it was downtown in the courthouse. They held it in the courthouse, by the way, to give it the appearance of being a legal proceeding. It wasn't. It was basically a shaming exercise. So there was very little union support, and quite the opposite. Reuther actually directs several of his staff to cooperate with HUAC and testify against the folks from Local 600.
Yeah, I didn't realize the hearings were happening everywhere. I thought they were being called into DC. They were taking.
There were repeated hearings in DC, but also it traveled around. And I'm just going to add one last thing, from me. I mean, obviously, if folks have more comments, that's more than welcome. But in the 1960s, HUAC said, well, maybe we should have hearings on the Ku Klux Klan. And Ernie Goodman and the National Lawyers Guild says, no, you should not have hearings on the Ku Klux Klan unless you want to talk about the Ku Klux Klan engaging in explicit and clear acts of incitement to violence. Otherwise, if you're just going to investigate what they believe and what they think, how's that any different from what you did to us? And actually, what you're interfering with is their right of expression. What we need to do is counter that expression with our own, but without calling in the national government to organize a shaming exercise that could lead to what, God knows what. It could include vigilante action, which is what HUAC did. So an interesting sidelight for me, and I was very heartened to see Goodman and the rest of them making that argument. We don't want to reproduce congressional hearings that simply go after what you believe. The most recent congressional hearings, remember, were about what Trump did. The incitement to actual violence and interference with an election. That was, in other words, an investigation focused on a specific act, not on a general belief, which, however much you might find those general beliefs reprehensible, we don't want to reproduce a HUAC that simply looks in the other direction and is misbehaving. Alan, would you have? Okay. Any other comment?
The fact that he protested the war, by, in this way of saying I'm just against this imperialist wars, did that spur other or peace movement or anti-imperialist movements, or was that picked up anywhere by any?
Not during the war, it was picked up in the UK, it was picked up to some degree, and I'm glad you brought this up. The socialist movement, the Second International, claimed that they would refuse to fight in any imperialist war, and then the war starts and it collapses. There's only two places, actually, where socialist parties come out against the war. One's Italy, which prompts Mussolini to bolt Socialist Party and organize a fascist movement down the road. And the other one is the United States, the only other socialist party that condemned the war, and so did the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies. And they pay a huge price for it. And I went too slowly at parts here, and so I dropped some of this, but the actual repression of anti-war sentiment in the United States was much more severe than in England. Because in the United States, it leads to assassination of some IWW members. The entire leadership of the IWW is arrested. Eugene Debs goes to prison, along with hundreds of others for their expression of anti-war belief. So it's a very different circumstance in the United States, where the Socialist Party comes out against it and where the ideology, 100% Americanism, is much stronger. And leads to a really severe repression of the left here in the United States. And there was something else I was going to say. You know what it was?
Certainly.
Okay. All right, you were. Oh no, actually, first here. Let me.
Just a comment, liberal bastion, I saw an article in the New York Times, which I'm about ready to cancel. Eric Adams praising his goon squad over beating and choking, basically causing a riot, peaceful Palestinian protesters. The worst part was reading the comments, and there were about 2,500 comments. I didn't read them all, but I would say half, they had it coming. They all had it coming. Nobody should be allowed to interfere with my time and my being able to get to somewhere. They should all be in jail. 50%.
Yeah,
in favor of the police beating the shit out of these people.
and you reminded me of what I was going to say.
Good work.
Thank you. And that is that war is obviously a context in which these sentiments are inflamed. Now, we aren't directly at war, but a lot of people identify with what the two adversaries, one way or the other. And so that always inflames that kind of opinion. And what I forgot to mention during the presentation was that Local 600 came out during the Korean War calling for a ceasefire. And this was considered another measure of their un-American and subversive behavior. So thank you for reminding me.
I was just going to toss in the notion of the strength of the anti-war movement against the First World War led to the president hiring Edward Bernays to sell the war. And Edward Bernays is the father of American advertising and public relations.
Right.
And
Right, because in the United States, anti-war opinion it fell back on a broader base of people who had wanted nothing to do with Europe. Certainly a lot of German Americans wanted nothing to do with the US entering the war on the side of the British, and a lot of Irish in the United States were equally appalled by the notion that we would be allies with the British. And so the Socialist Party position, the IWW position, falls back on a broader base, in effect, of folks who are not ideologically inclined to the left, but are opposed to siding on one side or the other in the European conflict. And that's why the repression of that's another reason, including what you just mentioned, is such a comprehensive and violent response.
I'd be interested in your perspective on the sort of parallels between the behavior of HUAC and the current oversight behavior we're seeing in the House now, with, Jim Jordan's weaponization committee, judiciary committee, and the oversight committee, these kinds of activities, how do you see, what kind of parallels do you see between the two?
The parallel I see, I think it's quite evident that their intention is not unlike what Martin Dye was about, shaming and branding, and then whole public opinion will intervene either to blacklist or in the form of vigilante activity. And what's happening now is going to be much more difficult for actually those who want to adopt that approach. Because obviously the population is not uniformly behind those sentiments. There's a real split and a real difference of opinion. What worries me is that, but I gotta talk about Germany, 1932, and where there was also a widespread contention about which way to go, and where the opposition was split between the communists and the socialist parties. But Hitler's strategy, he made it very clear, and Alan Bullock wrote a great book about Hitler's rise to power. It's called A Study in Tyranny. And what he makes clear is that what Hitler was about was to give the appearance of legality, to get a toehold and a foothold on government power, and then go to town and use police, military power to crush the opposition and eliminate democracy. Sounds scary, doesn't it? Because that's the mechanism by which Hitler actually won power. He also, by the way, 1932 meets with a long meeting, I believe it was in Strasbourg, with leaders of German industry, and persuades them that that's what he's about. I'm going to take power legally. We have renounced the black shirts and the brown shirts. They are no longer part of my movement, he says. Now they were, but for the time being, they weren't. And what we will do is reward business with a meritocracy in government, just like you believe in a meritocracy in the private sector. They should be both. Democracy is to government what communism is to corporate Germany. They're both equally dangerous. And I will reinstitute meritocracy. You're here, he says to the executive, because of your outstanding, contribution to the wealth of the camp and your ability and so on. And that's what we should also have in government. And side with me. And so he goes from being in the 1932 and 33 elections up until that moment. There's a fiscal crisis within the Nazi movement. They don't have enough money to conduct a national campaign. And then all of a sudden, they got films, they got airplanes, they got newspapers. And it was this money that flowed to them on the premise that once we're in power, once we have taken power, well, we'll set part of the Reichstag and then introduce emergency measures to implement our plan for the future. I'm not sure I was answering your question.
It's nice wrap though.
It's probably by the third question, because those hearings, I mean, this was a different set of hearings, but the hearings involving the university presidents struck as what you were describing, which is a focus on their ideas, a focus on their beliefs and trying them as opposed to what they did.
Right, it's a shaming exercise, and what they were counting on, that then the board of governors would eliminate them. And so that it's the same mechanism in that regard. But it's more contested, because there's now people who are more overtly and confidently resisting it. So to me, that's a hopeful difference between what we were talking about here.
Well, and it's a rare moment of alignment between the university unions and the administration.
Yeah. Good point.
I don't want this to end, but I think we need to move to a slightly informal space because we only have the room for so long, and we should get to the food and pepper you with questions while you're trying to eat.
Okay.
Can we get another hand for Dr. Babson?